All right, welcome back. This is going to be chapter 12 from, excuse me, from your elections and voting book. And we're going to be talking about party identification. So the chapter opens up with a short discussion of party ID and then offers three questions that they're going to sort of elaborate on party identification in this chapter. And those three questions are first, what does party identification do? What effects does it have in the political system? The second is, why and how do we have party ID? So, what is its purpose, sort of, and where does it come from? And then finally, how does party identification vary sort of across time and across the world, right? So we'll start off with what does party ID do? First, it helps voters to help sort of shape their choices about voting, right? You're much more likely to vote for the party that you are associated with. People do change occasionally, but it's pretty rare, and you usually stick with the party with which you're affiliated. Number two, it can shape the choices sort of indirectly by the book says, quote, helping make sense of information. I would say helping filter information because that's generally what we find in the literature is that it's not as benign as the authors say. It's not necessarily quote helping make sense of information. It is literally a filter through which information is received and sort of parsed, and then you know either rejected or accepted into your sort of ideological vision. Um, but yeah, it really provides a filter for how information is received, right? You're very I research finds that you're very unlikely, um, unless you're sort of at the very higher levels of education, or you're sort of maybe an independent who's outside of the political system. You're very unlikely to accept information sort of against your political affiliation, right? Um, we find time and time again that people sort of minimize bad information about their own political viewpoints of the world, right? Um, so in this way, party ID can sort of help shape economic news information, right? Um, when we say unemployment is 5%, the party in power is probably hailing that as a good thing. The opposition probably hailing it as a bad thing. So it can sort of shape economic news. We also know that it shapes views of corruption, right? I mean, right here in the United States, you have Donald Trump, who is up for like 90 felonies. There has to have been some corruption going on, and yet many conservatives are sort of willing to give him a pass for it, and it even seems to be like strengthening his argument again amongst some who are sort of anti-government, right? And so, I mean, even that very at-home example can show you sort of how corruption can be filtered through party identification. Um, so party ID serves as sort of a heuristic, as we've talked about. Heuristic just means informational shortcut. So your political party affiliation um, can, or excuse me, someone else's political party affiliation, especially sort of a candidate or a representative, um, their party ID can serve as a heuristic about what they're likely to vote on economically, socially, all those sorts of things, right? If you don't know anything about your sort of say a local mayor's race, but they're a Democrat, they're probably more likely to support things like abortion and welfare, greater sort of government expenditure, all of those things, right? And the opposite for the a conservative, and that's regardless of whether you know anything about those candidates. We also find through a lot of research that party ID actually increases turnout and political interest. So those who are affiliated with a political party tend to turn out more than those who are not. Um, and those like downs on the rational choice side would say, well, that's because they have this informational shortcut that reduces sort of the C term, the cost term in your rational choice model, and therefore people are more likely to turn out, right? But it also increases your interest in politics, which Downs sort of wouldn't be able to explain, right? So you're both more interested and you stay more abreast of sort of political situations and you vote more. And there are some sort of normative or political theorists outside of sort of the methodological researchers that mostly make up political science. There are some political theorists, and they also say that party identification can be a sign of a healthy democracy. Why is that? First of all, because it increases interest and it increases turnout. But it can also, we also find that people have greater feelings of sort of political efficaciousness. They feel like they have an effect on the political system. They're more likely to support their sort of democratic institutions. And so, in that sense, sort of the normative argument is that party ID is not only good for some of those other things like informational shortcuts and aggregating vote choices and things like that, but it's also just good for your society. All right, so we'll move on to the second question. The second question is why and how do we have party identification? We've touched on this before in this class. Most of party identification comes from childhood socialization, as we've talked about. It comes from sort of your family and your church structure and your school structure. But mostly, if your parents share a political ideology, which most do, then you're going to be sort of have a party attachment to their political party, right? There are a scant few who suggest that like it's not childhood socialization, but sort of life experiences that lead to later party attachment. The only couple of places I think this fits, and I think the book sort of touches on this, are first in new democracies, right? Where you haven't had a chance to be socialized into a political party by your family because the tyrannical dictator or whatever has just been overthrown and you've transitioned toward democracy. This is a first, or the first couple elections. Parties are brand new in their infancy, and you've really had no experience with them before, right? So that's an interesting avenue for the research. The second, and we do find that new democracies tend to be far more volatile electorally. There's a lot more like party creation and destruction in the first couple of decades. People are voting all over the board rather than with a sort of a singular political party. People drop in and out of the elections. They're not sort of habitual voters. So we do find a lot of sort of random chaos in new democracies. Another case in which sort of the childhood socialization bit wouldn't really fit, right, is for immigration. When immigrants come to a new country, so you've got a lot of sort of South American immigrants in America, and you've got a lot of sort of African and Middle Eastern immigrants in Europe. They come to a new country and they have no experience of the political parties, and we do find that they do tend to settle under a political party eventually, but those are really the only two contexts where childhood socialization doesn't really fit, right? So we'll move on to the third question. How does party identification vary? So they sort of touch on two different ways it can vary. One is across countries, and the other is across time. They really don't touch on time all that much. They give a really sort of singular example of California. in the 1960s had like 95 to 97% party attachment to one of the two political parties. If you move on 3 or 4 decades to the 2000s, it's more like 70 to 75% of the population is attached to one party or another. And so you see this massive rise in sort of independent voters in the United States. But the more interesting argument, I think, is their sort of comparative analysis. They find that 44% of citizens who can vote across the world are have party attachment. So pretty low, actually, below the majority, 44%. This is across sort of all democracies. But there's a vast range there. It ranges from a low of 6%, right, in Thailand. Thailand is notoriously corrupt. And so a lot of people have sort of fled their political system because even though there's been sort of party turnover and arrests and imprisonments and all of these sort of things to sort of deter corruption, corruption has occurred on both sides of the political spectrum. And people, I remember Thaksin Shinawatra was their prime minister. She stole billions of dollars from their government coffers and fled to Europe. Her brother did the same the decade before her. So it's a mess, right? On the other end of the spectrum, you have Australia, where you have 80% of people who still, in this day and age, have party attachment. It's a long-standing democracy. Their parties are really distinct from each other. And they also have sort of mandatory voting, so you have to sort of think out what party you want to support, right? Which helps lend to greater party affiliation. Let's see. Oh, we also find that there are some correlates of increasing partisanship. If you want to increase your citizens' attachment to a political party, some things that you can do is have strong party discipline, right? Where the party sort of controls the votes of their members and, in some sense, the behaviors of their members and their speech and their media, announcements and things like that. That helps strengthen people's sort of party affiliation rather than affiliation with individual members of their party, like we see a lot of in the United States. And then fewer parties in government, right? You want to have a small handful. Anywhere from like 2 to 4. Once you start to get out into that 7 to 10 range of political parties, you're really causing a lot of chaos. It causes a lot more sort of informational problems, and people sort of tend not to attach to a political party when there's that many in the system. All right, I know this was a long one. This was chapter 12, and I will see you in the next one for chapter 13. Have a great day.